Now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Heather Zierhut, who's an associate professor in the Department of Genetics, Cell Biology, and Development at the University of Minnesota in the United States. She's the current program director of the Graduate Program of Study in Genetic Counseling, and her major area of interest focuses on the educational and clinical preparation of genetic counseling professionals, as well as the implications of genetics and genetic counseling on public health. Heather's current research is focused on genetics and public health screening programs such as FH, or integrating genetics into primary care medicine, and the outcomes of genetic counseling. She is one of the leading researchers on genetic counseling outcomes in the United States and has worked closely with NSGC as they support such efforts. And importantly, Heather is a very active member in the NSGC and is currently NSGC's president during this year. So it's a pleasure to have her here to talk with us today. Thanks, Heather.
Thanks so much, Kelly. I have to say, I am very glad to not be in my attic in Minneapolis right now. That's where I spent the majority of the last 2.5 years, and so it is a pleasure to be here in Vienna with all of you, and hopefully to meet some new and future colleagues. So thank you very much, Kelly, for the invitation to be here. I also will say that this is about 10 years of my academic and research life as well, and it was a pleasure to have to reflect and to look back at kind of where I've personally been, as well as where the field has been and how we've grown in the last 10 years in outcomes and process research in the US. So, thank you, Kelly, for already giving some of those disclosures of my employment. I also have stock options in a genetic services company, Genome Medical or Gene Matters. Those financial conflicts I don't think will be obvious, but of course they can lead to, in small ways, to influence, so I want to acknowledge them here. I'm going to cover 4 main topics, and the first is thinking about this evolution of genetic counseling outcomes research, really from my perspective, working as a volunteer within the National Society of Genetic Counselors and some of the things that we were charged to do as an organization and as a volunteer. And then that's going to transition into some of this personal research to really try to figure out how I could wrap my brain around everything that was happening in the outcome space, as well as some of these processes that genetic counselors do, and how do those impact outcomes, which I think were some of the questions we were starting to hear come out in the Q&A. And that really striked my interest in process and trying to better understand what's actually happening in genetic counseling. And this is a really prime place to have those conversations, given that when we use the term genetic counseling, I have a feeling that might look very differently depending upon the country that we're coming from. Maybe not, so I'm curious. And then lastly, I'm going to bring this all together with an intervention that we developed that combined the framework that I'm going to use and process and outcomes together using the condition of familial hypercholesterolemia as an example. So please tweet away. This is my Twitter account, except I will have some unpublished and data that's under revision, and really appreciate those not being tweeted out until they are officially published. So my lens and my perspective is definitely that from North America, specifically in the United States. And as you will see in my presentation, Marion was always 2 or 10 steps ahead. So we sometimes had to redo things because we were so far behind. And so you will see some of the similarities as well as some of the differences when we think about this from that US perspective. I do want to take this advantage to hopefully get to meet some colleagues from around the world, so I do hope that you will come up and introduce yourselves, and I will get to know you as well. I'm going on sabbatical in a couple of years, so I'm also looking for places to maybe travel. I told Kelly I was going to shoot my shot here. So all of this work, as we heard from one of the plenary speakers yesterday, is really a team sport, and I really do try to have as much fun doing this research as possible. And one of the ways I do that is with great collaborators, and all of this work has really been influenced by Dr. Debbie Cragen, who is at the University of South Florida. And so I wanted to recognize her first and foremost, as well as the many students and collaborators that you're going to see their works just on the bottom of my reference pages, but really are significant to this work and really want to put them up front. Debbie is the pessimist. To my optimist, she is the details to my pie in the sky, and so we really are a great team. So I was never set out in my world to be an outcomes researcher or a process researcher. This was a task I was excited to be a volunteer and to meet some new people. And somehow I got in charge of the first working group at the NSGC, really focused on a charge of figuring out how to prioritize outcomes for the field, which seemed like the holy grail, and I really like the Monty Python. So in a lot of my previous presentations, I've used this as the holy grail, as this set of validated measures that's really the focus of our field. But what we quickly realized in this working group is that we really had to step back to these many different mountains of research that came in our way and figure out what had already been done, what was missing, and then how do we actually organize this information to make it accessible to a broader group of people, and not only researchers, but genetic counselors in the field that are sitting working with these patients day by day to try to understand and make this type of information accessible. So I'm going to be walking you through some of these today. So, similar to Marion, we started with a scoping review. You'll notice this is like 5 or 6 years after theirs was published, and we found very similar themes to what was discussed. And so I'm noting these here, things like knowledge, satisfaction, decisional conflict, anxiety and distress, perceived risk, and health behaviors. An area that we focus on, I think, a decent amount in the US is also genetic testing. And being that I think we're sometimes compared to the wild, wild west of genetic testing, that some of the ways that we're evaluated are in the receipt of or the intention to have genetic testing. And so those were other types of outcomes that had been looked at in our review. To try to figure out more what was missing, we knew from this list that there were other ways of thinking about what we did as genetic counselors that wasn't kind of coming out in the themes that we were seeing in the literature. So we asked a question, we kind of flipped it on its head in a series of 14 focus groups with about 120 genetic counselors at a meeting similar like this at NSGC. And so in those focus groups, the central question was, what would happen if genetic counseling didn't exist? If you instantly vanished from your place of employment, what would be missing? And the 4 main themes were these ones that you see in these boxes here. The adherence or receipt of appropriate medical management, appropriateness of testing and accurate results interpretation, knowledge, and psychosocial outcomes. But there were some really interesting other ones. And one area that I think is still underexplored in our field is coordination of care. What is the role of the genetic counselor in navigating and helping navigate this genetic services journey? What about insurance and cost savings? This is a big one that we focus on in the US. Efficiency, timely access, risk assessment, specifically of accurate and complete risk assessment, and providing patients resources. So it started to get a little overwhelming at this point in time in my research journey, thinking about all of the different ways we can think about studying outcomes of genetic counseling. And it turned into a very large Excel spreadsheet. I called this Excel hell. And it was really hard to try to figure out, even when you're writing papers, how to talk about all of these different ways that we can think about evaluation of genetic counseling. And so this started my next journey, which was thinking about how can we categorize and create maybe some type of framework that can make this more accessible and maybe a little bit more fun. And this is also where my journey kind of diverged from the NSGC volunteer work, in which NSGC decided to focus on cost, quality, and I don't think it was efficiency, access, something else. There's a third one. I'll tell you afterwards. And so in that way, there was a bit of a divergence. So the focus framework was named for Framework for Outcomes in Clinical Communication Services and Genetic Counseling. Note that clever U that we found in there. We really struggled with figuring out how to name this, and so this is what we ended on. The goal was to organize, consolidate, and conceptualize clinical outcomes, to postulate how these outcomes connect to genetic counseling processes, and then to align them with components of possible measures. And so to do that, we basically worked together every Wednesday for an hour and a half for about 2 years, maybe more. where we created a modified logic model approach, which is just basically a fancy word for, the inputs, the outputs, the activities that we do as genetic counselors. And we started from the end, working with kind of these distal outcomes to more proximal outcomes that are direct in genetic counseling. This is very iterative. As I said, Debbie and I really can go head to head from, various ways of having to think about this. And we incorporated our own personal clinical practice and research experiences, but also many of these different models and published literature, as well as that Excel hell that you saw. And so this is what I think, as Marion was saying, those beautiful, I think we get to a point in our research where this was basically the cleanest, most beautiful version that we could get to. And for those of you that are familiar with the reciprocal engagement model of genetic counseling, that's over here is really where you can see that strategy and goals and the measures of the actual care that's provided. And then as you get more distally, you see these patient care experiences, changes, health, and then family changes. And again, our goal was to be more accessible. So Debbie also has a talent of creating websites. And so she helped to design this website so that we were able to use it in workshops, in training, in education to help make this not just a paper, but also something that people could use to, again, start to think through the work that we do and how do we measure it. And so I'll go through each of these individually. This is an example of the worksheet that we used. A strategy we defined as a careful plan or method, especially for achieving an end or a goal. Patient care experiences, this is what I think many people call PROMs. Feedback from patients and their families or caregivers about their experiences related to the delivery of patient care. Patient changes, which were cognitive, emotional, or behavioral changes during or after the visit with the healthcare provider. Patient health, which were changes in physical, mental, or social health. And then family changes, cognitive, emotional, or behavioral changes among the patient's family as an indirect result of health services provided to the patient. And in this activity, then, once someone's going through and filling that out, they can then attach measures. So I'm going to give an example of a personal story I always love to incorporate. This is my partner, Brian, who's out playing around in Vienna right now. And that's his father, Scott, who's currently watching our dog and may never watch our dog again after what happened yesterday. You can ask me about that later as well. But Scott received a genetic counseling letter from his brother, and in that process, he took the letter, as we ask, usually this part went well. Here's your letter, take it to your provider, and talk to your provider about what the letter says. Unfortunately, the provider that Scott brought the letter to said that if he had had this genetic change, he would have had cancer already. So he's 70-some years old, and so he did not get his needs assessed. He was not able to identify ways to reduce his health, and so no at-risk family members were identified. Because of that, he, although, was happy to know that this result, so he was satisfied, and he trusted in his provider and felt like it was a good, end result to his experience. Now, we all know that the rest of these other areas cannot be affected if at this point in time you don't have access to the proper and accurate information or risk assessment, so on and so forth. So I call this the Heather intervention. So when I met Brian, I was at a family get-together, a barbecue, and his uncle came up to me and said, "Oh, I know genetic counseling," and you're always like, okay. Right, what does that mean? And he said, "Oh yeah, I saw a genetic counselor," and he used the name, and so I instantly knew it was a cancer-related indication. And so I then asked Scott afterwards what this was all about, and he said, "Oh yeah, I got this letter." And I was like, "Oh, can I see that letter?" And he still had the letter, believe it or not, because Scott saves everything. And he was a Lynch syndrome, his brother was a Lynch syndrome carrier. So Brian went to see a genetic counselor. He was able to get his needs assessed. He was able to identify ways to reduce his health and to identify at-risk family members. He was very satisfied with this experience and then went on to get testing, where he did have an accurate understanding of the information, although he said we gave way too much information. He also believed that disclosing that information was helpful, and he was able to access resources to get testing. He now goes in to get his annual colonoscopy, and he hopefully, if identified, would be identified at an earlier stage. As a person who researches cascade screening, I can tell you it was not optimal in his family, even with the Heather intervention. So I understand the realities of how hard it is to sometimes cascade in reality. But family functioning was not affected or impacted, and so this, again, takes you through the journey of what this can actually look like. So I still haven't gotten to the Holy Grail. We've now gotten to a place where we're starting to, again, as Kelly mentioned, systematically think about outcomes of genetic counseling, but really to have that a prioritized list was still something that is, I think, challenging. And Krista Redlinger-Grossi, a good colleague of mine, developed a Delphi study looking at 4 major stakeholder groups: clinical genetic counselors, training directors, outcomes researchers, and consumers and advocates. And this was our goal. Again, this was about 10 plus years after the Delphi in the UK, was to try to establish a base for those very long list of outcomes and similarities, and look for similarities across stakeholder groups, as well as look at the relative importance of this really long list of potential outcomes. And so this was a 2-round online Delphi, and we only had about 15 people in each of the stakeholder groups. So there's definitely more work to be done. But one of the things that you can kind of see here in green are some of the areas of similarities, and this is the focused domain of process outcomes. This is where a lot of the high relative importance outcomes were rated across the different groups. And so what we see here is going back to that theme of the patient's informational needs, and the delivery of that information was important, as well as the collaborative, compassionate, and patient-centered manner that it was delivered in. Going to the next category or domain, patient care experience, informational needs were again consistently rated as highly important. As we started to get to the next domain, patient changes, we started to see some differences here. And what we noted was that there was greater agreement between consumers or advocates and clinical genetic counselors than the other 2 groups, program directors being the ones that had the next most similar ratings, and then lastly was researchers. And we hypothesized that the reasons why someone, a genetic counselor for instance, or a researcher might have different goals of what they're hoping to measure in a session. And the consumer and prenatal or practicing genetic counselors may want to have more of those direct impact. What are the things that actually happened in the genetic counseling session itself that can create a direct impact? So in general, we started to notice as we went further along to the more indirect outcomes that those became rated of lower importance. So from this work, we started to really kind of recognize the importance of some of those process measures and actually trying to figure out what is happening in genetic counseling, what is actually going on, and how do we think about this from the perspective of patients. And then also thinking about, we may need more information from the patient perspective, as well as trying to better assess the genetic counseling process. So this leads me into some of the newer work that I've been thinking about and working on recently. So I call this then the genetic magic happens. So Marion and I worked on writing the standards for reporting of genetic counseling interventions. And this was helping after some of the systematic reviews, we realized that people were not documenting what they meant by genetic counseling. So what was actually happening in the genetic counseling itself? And so there was a big question mark about what was going on to affect those outcomes. And there was some unpublished data that unfortunately I don't think will ever get published because the student stopped responding to, I was not involved with this specific project other than to be a collaborator, but what that student project did show in this unpublished data is that of the GSERS, the standards tool, that the description of the intervention was the least. In less than 20% of cases, there was a description of an intervention. So we know that this is not being well elucidated in the literature, at least not when we did this several years ago. So what do we mean by genetic counseling processes? What is a skill or a behavior? And the ways that we defined it and focus was the overall combination of skills and processes employed to achieve the goals. In the REM, a strategy is a careful plan or method, especially for achieving an end. And a behavior in the REM is an action or reaction or a personal conduct. And I have to say, in some of our papers, we're not even consistent because we had reviewers that specifically wanted us to think about using different terminology. So I think this is an area where we probably need to think about what do we mean by skills, strategies, and behaviors, and how do we consistently define them. So I'm going to use processes just broadly to encompass those different terms, but I'll also try to be specific when I can. So Krista did some work to try to elaborate. So when the reciprocal engagement model was developed, the strategies were not fully elucidated. They ran out of time. And so what she did is she went back and looked at focus group data as well as some data from successful and unsuccessful genetic counseling sessions, and she pulled out strategies and used a Q-sort method for ranking those to try to take these strategies and create a set of domains. And so she was able to do that in this paper here. So we have large strategy domains now outlined. We also wanted to see within our focus framework where when we developed the framework, we didn't feel very confident that we had specifically validated or had the right terminology when we were looking at those strategies. And so Debbie and a student came together and interviewed 19 practicing genetic counselors from prenatal, pediatrics, and cancer to see what skills did they say that they actually consciously used when they were doing their genetic counseling. And one of the outcomes of the study is, yes, we were able to say that we do think our focus strategies are with minor modifications, looking good. But genetic counselors really struggled to describe the skills or used consistent terminology to describe what they were actually doing within their genetic counseling sessions. So again, I think we need a vocabulary here and a common vocabulary, at least in thinking about even teaching, about how we're teaching the skills, at least in the United States, and what words we're using to describe what we're doing. So in order to study process, there is a variety of different ways that you can do it. Some use checklists, some use reviewing transcripts of genetic counseling and coding, depending upon the different types of codes that you want to use. So I think one of the most famous is, in our field, is RIAS, the Rotor Interaction Analysis System, as well as looking through medical records to see what was done or what was not done or guidelines that were followed. And so Debbie and I thought, well, let's think about how we could make a pragmatic checklist that could try to capture and distinguish between what skills genetic counselors are using in the sessions and be able to look at that across, say, specialties or even individual counselors over time. So to develop this checklist, we used another interactive multi-step process, and we evaluated different constructs such as the practicality of using the instrument. How quickly can you use it? Can you use it in real time? Can you use it with transcripts or audio recordings, and how quickly or how much work does it take to go back and use it? We examined inter-rater reliability, content validity, and we're still in the process of further revising, even though we've done multiple iterations already. So this is under revision. We wanted to go back and do more detailed, and the reviewers requested more inter-rater reliability. So that's currently what we're working on, and we're using 64 standardized patients, videos that we've done with a diverse set of counselors from throughout the United States that we recorded last summer. And we're excited to let you know that I don't have the full data, but the inter-rater reliability is looking really good. So the 8 domains within the checklist are building rapport, mutual agenda setting and structuring, risk communication, recognizing and responding to emotions, educating, checking for understanding, facilitating decision-making, and promoting patient engagement. And I just realized that this is the first time I'm ever reporting this out loud, and it just got me really, really excited. It's a big moment to actually get to the point of actually starting to think about this. So this is what it actually looks like. Each one of these different domains has between 5 and 8 items, and we know that this is not particularly practical because it's about 50 items total, so we know there's a lot of work that needs to be done. But again, this is a starting point. So an example under the building rapport is attending to the environment, starting out positive, introducing yourself, and facilitating two-way communication. So again, this is a tool that we hope, it's very much in its infancy. As you saw from Marion's talk, any type of metric is going to take a lot of work, a lot of development, and will probably not be even usable for quite some time, but we are invested in trying to start to look at the process. And we hope that this instrument will eventually allow us to do that in a way that's systematic. So I'm going to now transition to our intervention, and this was the one that I talked about in regards to familial hypercholesterolemia. It was the CHEERS study, and it was working with parents of children that had FH, and it used a genetic counseling motivational interviewing approach, which is a directive client-centered counseling approach that is geared towards behavioral change. So anyone that was in the talk yesterday, you know where I now go on the behavioral change direction for genetic counselors. And it incorporated the extended parallel process model, which I won't have time to go into detail today, but that has 4 main constructs: susceptibility to the disease, severity of the disease, self-efficacy, and response efficacy. And our 2 main outcomes that we were studying were cholesterol screening in at-risk family members and communication of risk information. We created an intervention guide, and visual aids are available. This was based off of a family care study that was looking at uptake of cholesterol or colorectal screening, and so we modeled it after that, but also obviously geared it towards familial hypercholesterolemia and pediatric patients. We used focus to describe our strategy as well as the various different outcome measures that we included in several post-test surveys longitudinally, where we assessed a variety of different measures. One of the validated measures that we used was the Informing Relatives Index, which had a positive motivation and a negative motivation scale, and that will come up in a bit in regards to our findings. So Bridget reviewed our 13 transcripts from these interventions. We knew this was a small sample. It's very hard to recruit parents of pediatric FH cases, but 13 was not horrible for a pilot. And then we used the Motivational Interviewing Skills Code, or MISC, to identify the MI structures of change talk. So change talk can be examples of, say, taking steps towards a goal, of thinking about the rationale for why you're doing something in a positive way, as well as maybe committing, for instance, to doing an act. So someone might say, next time I talk to my brother, I'll just bring this up. Or I'm thinking about my family get-together. Maybe that would be a time when I could think about talking with my family members. So going in the direction of positivity. And what we saw when we were looking at this change talk over time was that it increased, and these different EPPM metrics were included in our visual aids, and there was a sequence that they went in throughout the genetic counseling intervention. And so we saw that change talk increased over time, and it really peaked towards the end of the intervention. And this is helpful to know because in MI, this can be an indication that you can have a higher association of positive outcomes. Debbie used a technique called coincidence analysis, which is a qualitative content analysis. She's in Norway right now at a coincidence analysis meeting that I cannot describe, so I apologize. But basically what this analysis allows us to do is use small sample sizes to look at associated factors that can be contributing to outcomes. And the 2 main findings that we saw were that high change talk during the intervention, as well as the presence of those positive motivations in that validated measure, were the 2 indications that led to positive cascading outcomes. And that when those were absent, that was also when we would not see the cascading outcomes. So this was my first really attempt to try to bridge process and outcomes in a kind of novel way of thinking about an intervention. So I'll end and summarize with this slide. It felt like we've really grown in our ability to think about genetic counseling outcomes, and we've come so far. We've obviously started to validate measures, but I think we still have a long way to go in regards to thinking about how we incorporate genetic services and outcomes. And the NSGC is currently working on validation of the multidimensional, now I'm forgetting, informed choice scale, right? Yep. And so there's work there that's still happening. There's, I think, still ways to think about how we can creatively use these frameworks in education, as well as training and study design. I think that I'm excited about the new process research to come and describing really what is efficient and effective genetic counseling. And lastly, I look forward to the interventions that will come to help us really evaluate our process and our outcomes. So I really need some water, so I'm glad we're done. So thank you all. Marianne, I didn't want to steal Marianne's water.
There you go. Here. Of course. All right, Heather, thank you so much. It's, again, just incredible to listen to you summarize in half an hour all the things that you and NSGC have been working on for the past 10 years, so thank you for that. We'll take a few questions directly to Heather, and then I'm certain we're going to have plenty of time to have a dialogue here amongst everyone. So what are some questions people have for Heather about what she presented? Please go ahead and go to the mics.
Thank you, Heather. That was absolutely amazing. Thank you very much. My question was, I think I was wondering what your thoughts are on therapeutic alliance, counseling relationship, that sort of thing, whatever the words. I know the words can differ depending on the therapeutic approach. So where do you see that, and if you see it at all in your genetic counseling or the genetic counseling checklist that you mentioned earlier? Is it something that you think it's separate? Is it something that is a bit more trans-dimensional? Because we know it's responsible for quite a bit of the change in most psychosocial or psychotherapeutic interventions. So we expect to see that quite a lot, and we expect that to be responsible for change. So I was just wondering your thoughts on that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for raising that. You did kind of give away part of one of my grants. So, I mean, I guess it's not anything new, but yes, so we're really interested in studying how some of the parts of the GCC are also potentially protecting the therapeutic alliance. And one of my colleagues, who I didn't reference, Ian McFarlane, who I work with at the University of Minnesota, is really interested in trying to think about this tool and if it needs to be adapted and how it could be adapted for genetic counseling. And so if anybody is really interested in thinking through that, or is already several steps down the line, because again, I think that you guys are clearly usually several steps down, then we would love to talk about that and how we could work together to think about that more. So yes.
Chuck Lee, UK. Thanks for your talk here. I want to just put this into context of effectiveness of genetic counseling for rare diseases. Oftentimes, particularly when we're talking about heritable or inherited rare diseases, the patients themselves often double up as carers. Have your tools evolved to reflect essentially the effectiveness of counseling in the context of a patient and as a carer, given the care burden?
Yeah, so I'm not sure if I got the full question, but one of our other follow-up studies from our current is to take the measures that we've identified with the process, the GCC, and do various different patient-related reviews of those to see if that they think that these parts of the process are important, and then also are the outcome measures that we're proposing aligning with those. Does that answer your question, or am I off?
No, it answers in parts. I mean, I'll just leave with the thoughts that for some inheritable rare diseases, the genotype-phenotype is quite variable, right? So
Right.
the same disease will have mild to quite severe symptoms, and therefore the experience of living with that disease would vary. And I think it's worthwhile looking at the effectiveness of these tools in rare diseases.
Yeah, so in the framework, and I didn't speak to it, there was a context, right? And what are the variables that we aren't necessarily capturing through some of these measures that are really important? And those might be things like you're mentioning. And so I think it's always important for us to take a step back and think about what are some of the other things that we're not measuring that it can really be impacting how we're thinking about or evaluating it. So I really appreciate you raising that so that I could bring up that point as well. It's an important one. Thank you.
Thank you.
Heather, thank you. That was really interesting. I'm Rona MacLeod, genetic counsellor in Manchester. And from both you and Marion, what I liked was the various ways that the work you've done, the extensive work you can be done, can be used in different ways, both clinically, teaching and research. And I was thinking about the process research and thinking about some of the quantitative work and taking it back to patients. And so that was really interesting, that comment about reviewing it with patients and the process and maybe using that as a prompt. And I wondered if that might be done looking, say, again at videos of the actual sessions or looking for, outcomes within the session almost.
Yes. So what we're currently doing is we shot 64 pre and post genetic counseling sessions with standardized patients who were able to also do fill out some outcomes measures as well. And those were in cardio, prenatal, and oncology. And so we started to try to see, just to pilot those measures and see how people thought they related. So we have very small data to help us think through that. But yes, I think it's an area for exploration, but we haven't been able to go there yet. But did you have a specific question that I'm forgetting?
Probably I wasn't specific enough. I think what I was trying to think of was complementary methodologies as well, not necessarily your group, Heather, but just thinking about, I guess even thinking what Seymour was thinking about, actually looking at the sessions again or getting patients to look at their own sessions again, and you're developing a framework that might be a useful prompt to ask them questions about it. In the same way you're thinking about using it to maybe teach students,
Yes.
could patients be using that as a prompt to help them reflect on the process?
Yes, thank you. Because one of the things that we were going to pull out was some of these skills from these videos and ask, is this from someone that might be going through this, is this a skill that you think is going well or is it not? Because one of the things that we saw is in one of our videos, we had a very low rating. And it was very much, it was for the genetic counselors and genetic counseling students that ranked that video, it was very high. And so we all thought it was excellent. It was very psychosocial focused, but the patient ranked it very low. And so that was an indication to us that we might be off in how we're thinking about some of these sessions, and that thinking about that more broadly about what is it about what happened in that session that didn't go well, because we don't know, because we weren't able to ask follow-up questions. But could we do that in a way where we could use some of these videos to have, focus groups or conversations as well? So, yeah, happy to talk more if you have ideas.
Thank you, Rona. Heather, thank you so much for answering those questions. I'm going to ask Marion to come back up here and you to swap over here. And then I think we're going to continue this as a bit of a dialogue. So I'm going to swap spots. You can bring your water. And actually, I want to start by asking the two of you a question as I was sort of reflecting on the different approaches that people have taken, and that some of them focus a bit on the patient's perception of the outcome and empowerment issues, and some focus on the ways that we as genetic counselors are really trying to use our specific skills and behaviors to achieve those. Heather, you brought up the point about these direct and indirect outcomes and sort of the short-term and long-term outcomes. I would love for the two of you to just have a little bit of a dialogue about what you think are the important differences between those types of outcomes and perhaps how we measure it. I don't know if that's a concrete enough question to give you a place to start.
I don't know. I don't quite know what to say to that. I felt listening to Heather's presentation that I'm very single-minded, whereas I think Heather has a much broader view of the whole thing, and what you're trying to do is massive. It is.
So I think why so in the US health system, a lot of times we focus on the patient health because that's what payers and insurance and that's, the major impact. And so what I've learned a lot from Marion's work is actually thinking about that patient experience and being more narrow in the tools that we can use with that. And so I feel like depending upon the stakeholder and who I'm talking to, the outcomes that they prioritize are very different. And so that's why, I think that from thinking about the patient's perspective, it was a bit of a light bulb moment when we started thinking that they kept focusing on so much on process, but it made a lot of sense that that would be important because that was their personal experience. It's what they were actually experiencing, what happened or didn't happen. And so what I always get lost in and was sometimes in the weeds is, but then how do we distill that down to something that's actually usable, like Marion did? Like that's the goal that I think is really challenging and that I am so, I think I need to do more of is thinking through it. Like how am I gonna get to that point in some of these other areas that allows us to do that in a way that's actually usable?
Yeah, and I think usability for me, when it comes to sort of longer term outcomes and indirect outcomes, it becomes harder to link it directly to what you're actually doing in genetic counselling. The more distal the outcomes are, the harder it is to make the direct connection. And if what you're talking about is money at the end of the day, which sort of we're not really in the National Health Service in the UK yet, that may come, that we get paid based on how we deliver patient outcomes. We're not in that world yet.
Yeah, because I think we're forced to think about it with our current health system. And so what I think about is if you can show in a really rigorous study that there is some of that, if you can track the indirect outcomes in some way, right? Then you can measure the more direct impact with the assumption that that's going to happen over time. So I think it's the fact of really we've been pushed, I think, to think about changing actually patient health. And I think Janine Austin is one of the people who I know has pushed me to say like, but we actually do. So if we do make an impact, we need to say and show that we're making an impact. And then we can do easier ways to show that to measure that so that we don't have to do it every single time. But we really should push ourselves to think about the big public health, even types of ways that we think about this. So if we're going to evaluate, and when I think about FH, if I'm going to really push that cascade screening is really important, I need to be able to make those links. And so I do think connecting all of them is an important thing to do, but maybe you don't need to do it all the time outside of the research setting.
Be interesting to know other people's thoughts.
Yeah.
Yes, please. I'd love for audience members to get up and either comment or ask additional questions to our duo here, please. I know it's the end of the day, but...
Sorry, I'm Jen Fitzpatrick from Montreal, Canada. Really, really enjoyed both of your work. I was really blown away by the reach of it and the potential applications. I had a question for Heather about, it's a little bit off from where we just were. Do you see your 8-point checklist sort of translating into shaping our clinical competencies and the framework that we use when we are working with students?
No and yes. So it was not the intent. So I think anytime you develop a tool, there's a lot of people who look at it and think about the different ways it could be used. And so some of the people that have had some inside scoop into the tool have thought that it could be modified, for instance, for a quality control or some type of metric, for instance, in genetic services, where you could see what's being done. And Debbie using it with her students to try to understand some of the ways that they can understand or actually use the instrument has actually seen it to be a really helpful teaching tool. And so I think that from her standpoint, I haven't tried to use it with my students or introduced it to my students other than the ones that are working on it as a research study. But again, one of my students is creating a module to help explain how to use and how to train on the instrument. And there is a description of things like teach back. There's a description of here's what teach back looks like. And so could we use some of those videos to, show skills in a teaching setting? Absolutely. So I think, what does building rapport look like? You can show some videos to show what that is. So we do see a lot of value in potentially teaching. I haven't personally explored it. I know Debbie has. In regards to competencies, the competencies in the US are changing, so we're hopefully going to get those soon. But I don't know what they're going to look like and how the checklist would work with those or not. But that wasn't a goal of ours with the checklist.
I have another question for the two of you, since I can take the moderator's prerogative here. I'm thinking about the concept of empowerment in relationship to the bioethical principle of autonomy. And wondering a little bit, since we're at a very international meeting here, if the two of you could speak to how your outcomes data might be centered around the different cultural worlds that we each live in and sort of where our practice is deriving from. Another easy one.
I'm so glad this wasn't yesterday when I was really, really jet-lagged. So thank you to whoever got this on today.
I'm not sure I can formulate a response. I suppose the word empowerment sort of implies autonomy. But whether it really does reflect autonomy is a completely different question. Mm-hmm. And I think, really, I wouldn't like to speak on behalf of patients. I hope that delivery of decisional control and delivery of other types of control is supporting patient autonomy. I hope. I hope that's what we do.
Have you found when your measure, Marion, was translated and used in different countries that came out, let me think of how to word this. Did it come across differently when it was then applied in those populations, or were you seeing that it really was a similar outcome?
I don't know if I know the answer to the question, because those translations are quite recent, and there haven't really been very many publications reporting on how that has played out. I think I can tell you about some of the translation issues there have been that have made the translation complicated. And one of the translation issues is that we very specifically use the term condition in the genetic counselling outcome scale. And interestingly, not every language has an equivalent word. Mm-hmm. Some languages can only use the term disease, which is all very well unless you're talking to a family where there is deafness, because they don't consider it to be a disease. And so there have been, I mean, that's not a cultural problem, it's a language problem. But it's interesting that in other languages there isn't an equivalent word. So they were some of the sort of challenges that we faced in the translation. I think it'll be interesting to also to see how it plays out with some of the more recent translations, which are in countries that I would consider to be even more different, like Japan and Korea and Qatar and countries which are more different from us culturally, to see how that plays out in the cognitive interviews. But we'll see.
Yeah, thank you.
I don't think I can answer that directly, Kelly, but I'll take this opportunity to answer a slightly similar question. So when some of the work that I didn't speak to was a student paper that looked at racial and ethnic differences in the U.S. of how outcomes were either perceived or the outcomes that they had. And I can say that there wasn't much data out there to actually be able to look at that. So I think it's a question that we should be asking ourselves. And then we did a similar looking at process of genetic counseling, and we did start to see some really creative ways of adapting the process. And so that review is still under development, but I think that there is a lot to explore there and a lot that I think we can think about, and I actually think will lead to maybe changes in practice over time. So at least from the current data that we have. So I appreciate the question and think we need to think, at least I personally need to think harder about it.
I'm going to give the audience one last chance to ask a question more concrete than my last two. Anybody? Yes, please.
So I guess I was just wondering about how the nature of genetic counselling is going to change over the next 10 years, particularly when we think about the more agnostic testing that we're going to be offering, and whether that's going to have a direct impact on the kind of outcomes that we're going to be measuring going forwards.
Do you want to speculate? I don't know.
I don't know either. I'll say it feels like we're kind of there a bit in the U.S. already, that there's a lot of talk of, healthy population testing and so on and so forth. But I'll just say I think the skills that we've used over time are still skills that we're using now, and so how those will actually be adapted and the outcomes, I'm not sure I think it might be more similar than we think.
Where we have the opportunity to actually do what we do, because we won't always.
Mm-hmm. Excellent point.
Hi, I'm Marlies van Dingen from the Netherlands, UMC Utrecht, and I was really wondering about both of your thoughts about genetic counseling moving into the digital context, and what your thoughts about digital innovations and digital technologies that are designed and developed for different purposes within the genetic counseling process.
Could you clarify exactly what you mean by that? I don't know whether you're referring to virtual genetic counselling or technologies around measuring outcomes, or not sure what you're referring to.
Digital technologies, not video conferencing or telephone contact, but for example, e-health platforms or chatbots that are developed to undertake some parts of the genetic counseling process. Does it change what genetic counseling is, for example, if parts are done by a chatbot, for example?
Well, that's why I think having outcome measures that you can rely on are important, so that we can look at what the impact is of introducing those new technologies.
Yeah, and I think to get more granular on what those specific technologies are doing and the process that the different pieces of the process that they are working on, most of them have been informational in nature, right?
Yeah.
And so a lot of those have also been non-inferiority types of studies, and what are some of the limitations to those. And so I think it just speaks to the fact of knowing actually what processes and skills are we using that are leading to the highest impact, and then what are some of those pieces within the process that maybe we are less in need of having the face-to-face or the specific technology to help those. So I think it just gets back to the trying to understand on a very granular level maybe where we're making the most impact, because we feel also a lot of push to be more efficient in our practice in the U.S. So how do we decrease the time that we're spent with patients? And so I also think it's critical that we don't just start changing our counseling without having an evidence base to determine what we take out and what we include.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Great. So we have about 2 minutes left. I'm going to give our two speakers the opportunity to say one final thought if they have something else they'd like to say before we wrap up.
I guess we did mention in the conversation a few minutes ago about money being attached to outcomes. And I personally, and I know I'll probably horrify all my NHS colleagues sitting in the audience, I personally wouldn't be averse to a world in which services are funded based on how well they deliver patient outcomes.
I'll take it one step further and say that in the United States, we're really advocating to be recognized by our government, which is the Centers for Medicaid and Medicaid Services. And when hopefully we do get recognized, we will also need to have metrics to be evaluated, and those will be potentially also tied to financial resources. So it is vital, and that is why NSGC, speaking with my president hat, has had to really think about this critically and try to be forward-thinking. And without research dollars, however, we cannot do these big studies that need to happen. And so I'm going to use my last minute to advocate for genetic counseling research dollars within our health systems, because we don't have the resources to do the research that really needs to be done in order to do that. And that is the basis of what we do.
Excellent. Well, I hope you'll all join me in thanking our two wonderful speakers who are the amazing genetic counseling leaders and researchers, and I've really enjoyed this. So thank you both for speaking today, and thanks to all of you for such great comments. Now we'll let everybody get out to dinner.